So I'd like to introduce Chris Bucholtz. He's a content marketer and journalist. He's been building scale aircraft models for decades. Let me introduce Chris Bucholtz.
I'm the managing editor of the International Plastic Modelers Society Journal for the US. I've been doing that for a long time. I've been doing regional coordination for Region 9, which is Northern California and Nevada, for a very long time, almost 20 years now. And that basically means keeping clubs happy with each other. It's amazing that little tribes can fight and have, do things like schedule a contest on the same day in two different parts of the state. Not a good thing. The books I've written include the 332nd Fighter Group, which is about the first combat history of the Tuskegee Airmen. I've also written a couple others. Honestly, those are offshoots of scale modeling. They're not because I decided I could write books about airplanes out of the blue. It was because I had been building models, and frankly, the Tuskegee Airmen book came about because I wanted to build a model for a contest of a Tuskegee Airmen aircraft, and I couldn't find a book that showed me a picture of an airplane that I could build. So I was sitting around complaining to my editor at the time, at a magazine I was writing, and she said, "Hey, idiot, you're a writer. Write the book you want to read." And so there you go. That's how modeling gets you into different things. From there, I got to do some stuff on the TV show Dogfights, which was on History Channel back when they showed things on History Channel about history. Dogfights was a great show about aviation combat, and I got to be on the Tuskegee Airmen episode, so that was pretty exciting. And then from there, I got to work on as a historical advisor for Red Tails, which was the George Lucas film about the Tuskegee Airmen. That movie drove me crazy, but things like the serial numbers on the vehicles and the airplanes and things like that, that was pretty good, so I can't complain too much about that. So I've been at it for quite a long time. I really love scale modeling, but I'm not like Jim. Jim is extremely prolific, and I get maybe 4 things done a year. So when I went over to Jim's house for the very first time to interview him, his room full of models, which at the time had about 1,200 models in it, blew my mind. It was the coolest thing in the world. And so I came home from this with rows and rows of shelves and a workspace, and it was just spectacular. I came home, I told my wife at the time about that, and I said, she saw this look at my face, and she said, no, no, no. So I'm not married to her anymore. My wife today is very different because she says no much louder than that. So everything is in the office, everything is contained. But anyway, let me talk a little bit more about Jim. You saw the picture there of the cover of 50 Plus magazine. I was the editor of 50 Plus magazine, which meant I did everything for 50 Plus magazine. And so you've got that picture of Jim. He's holding an Electra, and he's got a paintbrush, and the model is completely finished. And only an insane person would take a paintbrush to a finished model like that. But every modeler picture you ever see looks like this because it's impossible to get the point across when you've got a collection of vacuum form parts, for instance, sitting on a desk. It doesn't make any sense to the average person. So things about Jim that I love, 1/72nd scale is his scale. And for good reason. You can build everything from a BD5 up to the Spruce Goose in the same scale, and it actually is kind of manageable, although Jim shows there that the HK1 is perhaps not as manageable as I assume it to be. He and I share that in common. I'm a scale bigot as well. I only build 1/72nd scale for my aircraft, so I appreciate that. He was on 50 Plus, like I said, with that kind of fraudulent picture we staged for the cover. And this is one thing I love about Jim. He won an award. He's the only person I know who won an award at the IPMS National Convention, the biggest and most prestigious scale modeling event in the country. He's the only person I know who won an award at that event without ever entering. He brought a display in 1998 of Bay Area aviation models, including a scratch-built USS Macon, that was so impressive that testers awarded him an award for best presentation, and he didn't actually enter the contest, but it was well-deserved. But the round of applause you got was the equal of anybody at the contest, including the Best of Show winner that year. And he's also unafraid of building anything. So if you're in a model club or you know modelers, or you're a modeler yourself, you look at some subjects and you think, that's really cool. I'd love to have one of those, but that kit's pretty rough. Or there's no subject to that. I'd have to scratch build it. I don't want to put the time in. Or I just can't do that. That paint scheme is too difficult. It's just beyond my skill level. Well, I don't think Jim has ever had a moment like that, or if he did, that was so long ago in the past that it's not even an issue for him anymore. And it's very inspiring to see him come into the club with a model of something that we've never seen a model of. and hear him talk about how he's worked with people to build patterns for it and vacuum form it and make his own kit, essentially, of things like the VS44 or the HK1. These are models I would love to get my mitts on, hint, hint, Jim, at some point, get a version of those kits for myself. But it's really awesome to see him do it, because a lot of us are just stymied and we just take what we get. Jim does not do that, so that's really impressive. So let's talk about accuracy in modeling. I'm going to talk about 4 aspects of this. This is really an interesting way of tearing this apart and looking at it. Why it's important to scale modelers, why it's important to historians and to history, moreover, and why it's not judged in IPMS contests, and finally, why the internet has made it more important and easier to achieve accuracy than ever before. So let's start with the importance to modelers. Every modeler wants to build an accurate representation of the thing they want to build. So I think you can figure out the one on the left is the real one, and the one on the right is the model. In fact, the one on the right is the Aoshima P63 King Cobra from about 1967, 68, somewhere in there. And if you compare the two photos, you'll notice that the kit is a little bit off. I think the spinner is wrong, the nose isn't pointy enough, the cockpit's in the wrong place in relation to the wing, the wings aren't tapered enough, the fuselage isn't long enough, the rudder's wrho the drop tanks are in the wrong place. Basically, it doesn't look like what you were building. So if you're a modeler, this would drive you crazy. I've had people who had this as their only option for a kit of that airplane and that scale go through the process of trying to fix all those problems. The smart ones would convert it into an air racer and just modify the heck out of it, so you don't have to worry about accuracy at all. But this is what people had to put up with for a very long time. And the industry has been getting better over the years. The industry gets better and better all the time as technology advances, but things still go amiss. So the airplanes here, the P-51B, that's a Hasegawa kit, which came out probably about 25 or 28 years ago now, and it was very good kit for its time. But if you look at the wing root, there's a dog leg there. It veers up. It sort of angles toward the fuselage. And if you look at the real P-51B, that angle isn't there. And the reason for that is that the kit company wanted to stretch out the kits to cover both the P-51B and the P-51D, which had a very different wing and a different wheel well arrangement. And so they just put the D wing in the B kit. And of course, modelers who knew about it couldn't handle it and started doing things like making resin parts to replace the wings and doing all kinds of things on their own. So there's a big cottage industry now about making things more accurate, making them more detailed, making them more correct. And when it comes to accuracy, it's not just about the type of airplane. It can be individual aircraft. So this guy here is Don Gentili. He was an ace with the 4th Fighter Group. And that aircraft behind him is called Shangri-La, a very famous P-51B. He flew it in scoring most of his kills. I think he scored about 28 and a fraction kills. And then on his final mission, he was beating up the base and came across a high spot in the airfield and clipped the propeller and ended up crashing the airplane. So it's a very, very famous airplane. And if you look at the nose spinner, this is what drives a lot of modelers crazy, because they want to get nice, clean lines. Everything's very straight and put away. Look at that. Look at the spinner on that. They started painting the red, and then kind of gave up before they got to the end of the propeller. And if you look at the kill markings, he's got 4 markings on the bottom row of that scroll there. And also, the other thing to notice, that panel right in there, if you look at the demarcation line, it goes straight across. Well, here's a picture that appeared in my book for the very first time. This is Shangri-La the morning it crashed. So things to notice, there's a lot more kill markings, obviously, so it's a few weeks later. The things that modelers should notice is the spinner is all red now. And look at that panel. They've replaced that panel. So you can see the replacement panels change the demarcation line between the gray paint and the green paint. It's really interesting. Modelers love this kind of stuff. These kind of details make things stand out. But unfortunately, modelers don't always capture them. So here is almost the exact same shot in a nice scale model, a very nicely built scale model. But if you'll notice, he's only got the 5 markings here, and he's got the red spinner, and he doesn't have the panel here. Now, there's other things too. This is what drives modelers crazy. You get into the nitty-gritty of an individual aircraft. Take a look at the rearview mirror on top of the windscreen and the radio antenna mast. There is no rearview mirror, and the antenna mast is just that straight rod instead of the more shaped one. that came later. So these are the things that modelers try to capture, and there's a good reason for it. It's not just to make your model accurate for your own personal benefit. Historians find this stuff extremely important. The details of history are very easy to lose, and modelers are often, about aircraft, the only people who are going to be interested enough to preserve these things. So this aircraft here is at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. This is a P-47 D-30, and it's painted in the markings of Colonel Joe Laughlin, who was the commander of the 362nd Fighter Group. When they decided to redo this aircraft about 7 or 8 years ago, it's probably more like 10 when they started the project, they actually reached out to, of all people, me, and which was quite an honor. And the reason they did it was because in 1998, when we hosted the U.S. Nationals in Santa Clara, and I was the chairman, we had a giveaway decal sheet that we researched that included 5x5 for the very first time. And so the National Museum of the United States Air Force asked for a copy of this to serve as a guide for repainting the real airplane. Pretty cool. So when I actually went back there to the museum for the unveiling of the aircraft, the curator, Jeff Duford, that gentleman right there, in the words he was reading as they were unveiling the P-47, actually made a big shout out to the modeling community. And he said, modelers, I'll just read it. Modelers perform an invaluable service to our history by preserving the details of our nation's flying machines and the men and women who operate them. So modelers, as they try to do these things with the models they build, these miniatures they create, and trying to be as true to life and as accurate as possible, they're really institutionalizing the history of our aircraft history. It's really kind of cool. If you want to know the nitty-gritties about the aircraft, you talk to a modeler. People don't know a lot. Even pilots don't know as much about airplanes oftentimes as modelers. It's really kind of amazing. You ask a pilot, what color was your aircraft painted? And oftentimes he says, well, I know what the nose was painted. That's the only part I ever looked at, was right across the top of the nose. Now, history has a second aspect to it, that the other side of this is what I like to call the legend of the purple roof. So for many years, I think Johan had a kit of the A6M2N, which is a Japanese float fighter based on the Zero fighter, that had this kind of, I think theirs was almost like a magenta, a brownish one. I've seen purple ones, I've seen pink ones, and this is the model kit. And in books, well, books intended for modelers, you had a lot of purple roofs. And the reality is they never flew in these markings. They didn't look like this. The true story, which actually came out years and years and years later, was that when the U.S. invaded Kiska up in the Aleutian Islands, they found a A6M2 upside down, floating in the water. It had been there for several months. And what happened was the Japanese used a red oxide primer underneath the gray paint. Well, the part of the airplane that was in the water had started to, the gray paint had started to fade, and the primer started to come through. So you had one wrecked kind of pinkish airplane. But then people ran with it, and they made every roof from then on a purple roof. And the danger here is that the more that's propagated, the more models are built like that, the more it becomes part of the record, and the more people think it's what actually happened. Now we know better, and part of that, luckily for us, is because of the internet and more free flow of information around the world about this stuff. But it still can happen, and the last thing you want to do is build something into the historical record that wasn't there. So accuracy is incredibly important. It's what modelers strive for. It's what modelers really want to accomplish. But when it comes to our contests, we don't actually judge on accuracy. And people have a lot of problems with that. They really get confused about this. And there's good reasons for it. Here's some judges in action. The judge on the right there is a guy named Tim Nelson. Tim knows everything there is to know about things that went on in Seattle aviation, including Boeing things. So let's say Tim is an expert on some of these models on the table here. He's an expert on the T-28 Trojan, which is right next to his elbow on the table, right below him. So Tim knows everything about the T-28. He knows where all the antennas should be. He knows where whether the ailerons should be offset or whether the elevator should be drooped. He knows what the correct angle for the nose gear door is. He knows the proper pitch for the propeller when the engine's turned off. He knows how the canopy fastens. He knows every single detail about that airplane. So he looks at that Trojan and he can pick out all these little things that are wrong. But Tim doesn't know anything about the Sturmovik. This one down here. He knows nothing about the Sturmovik. So we just have to assume it's all right. So if you have an accuracy-based judging scheme in place, that means that every judge has to know every plane to the exact same detail, and it's just not humanly possible. So instead, we judge on craftsmanship. Are the seams all filled in? Is the airplane aligned? Are the wings aligned to the tail? Is the canopy aligned to the fuselage? Is the propeller on straight? Is the paint applied well? Are the clear parts actually still transparent? Those sort of things. And it's amazing how workmanship can work itself out to pick the winners 1, 2, 3. And what often happens is the people who are really committed to accuracy, they're also committed to building good models as good craftspeople. And if you look around at Jim's models here, you'll see that in spades. So that's why accuracy is not used as a judging criteria in the IPMS. It's even, there are things that people can get knocked for that are really obvious. There's a great example of that. There's a model entered an A-10 Thunderbolt with the national insignia flipped 180 degrees the wrong direction, upside down in the fuselage. And that person probably would have been called out by the judges on it, except he had a picture of the real one where they'd misapplied the national insignia in real life. So it can happen. As my friend Walt Fink said, he was a pilot. He says, I've flown in airplanes with the wrong markings, and I've flown in airplanes painted the wrong color, but I've never flown in an airplane with a big seam down the middle of the fuselage. So why is the internet a game changer? Well, here's the way it used to be. You would go, if you were lucky, you had a local model club you can go to, and there might be 3 or 4 or 5 guys who had experience hands-on with real airplanes. So you might have a guy in your club who was an experienced authority on the T-38, or somebody who was on a carrier who knew all about the S2 tracker, or somebody who'd flown a B-52. And those guys you'd go to for those information about those airplanes. They knew what they were talking about. If you had a question about something, they could answer that in detail. But once you got beyond the 3 or 4 or 5 airplanes that guys in your clubs really knew head to toe, you were out of luck, and you're starting to guess, and you're looking at spotty information that was out there in magazines and things like that. The internet has changed that. So now your model club is basically the entire world. And if you want to, and if you put yourself out there and ask questions, you're going to find people who know stuff that you never thought you would run across. A good example of that is I'm building a Sikorsky S-38 right now. I'm building OSA's Ark, which was flown by Osa and Martin Johnson in their explorations of Africa in 1934 and 35. And I wanted to know what it looked like in the airplane. Well, if I ask the guys in the club as much as they know, and there are some pretty knowledgeable guys in our club, the layout of that airplane was going to escape them because it was a customized layout for those people. As it turned out, when I put the question out there, there is an Osa and Martin Johnson Museum in Chanute, Kansas. The curator there was really excited about helping out. He dug into his, I put the question to him, and like 10 days went by, and he finally said he found in a filing cabinet in the back of the museum, pushed underneath some other files, 4 photographs of the interior of Osa's Ark that he himself hadn't seen in years. So I was able to use that to build my model as accurately as possible. The feeling there is great because I know this may be the first accurate Osa's Ark that's been built in a very, very long time. And it helped the museum unearth these things that they were looking for too. So just by putting it out there on the internet, you can find it. Also, there's other places you can find great information. There are documents online, military documents online if you know where to look for them. There are places like Hyperscale where you can ask people for help and get information. It's a totally different ballgame. I think Jim can attest to this. It's so different than it was just 10 years ago, where people have so much access to information that now being accurate it's not a leap. It's a thing you can achieve because you've got the information at your disposal. Once you have the information, accuracy becomes a matter of being able to put your hands in the right place and make the plastic do what you want it to do. So some final thoughts, and I thought I would horn in and sneak some of my own models in here in this exhibition because, next to good company. Models with small inaccuracies can still be great models. Like I said, craftsmanship is really an important thing. And you can't knock a model just because it is slightly inaccurate. That Mustang we saw earlier with the wrong antenna and the wrong rear view mirror, that is still a beautiful model. It's still a wonderful work of art. It's just not a completely accurate work of art. The other thing to keep in mind is that new data can make an accurate model inaccurate. And I have a first-hand experience with this. I built a model of Alan Deere's Spitfire, which was called Kiwi. He had several of these things, and they featured on the right side of the cockpit, or the left side of the cockpit, a big silver block with a kiwi bird in it, and the word Kiwi. He was a New Zealander. And after I got my model done and thought it was all perfectly perfectly accurate, I got a book from a friend of mine in New Zealand called Spitfire, the New Zealanders, which featured a whole bunch of personal pictures from people that had never been shown before, grainy little snapshots, including the other side of Kiwi, which had the Kiwi logo on the right side as well. So nobody's ever built an accurate Kiwi, apparently. So I've got to go back and fix that. Doesn't make the model bad, again, the model's still good, it just needs to be brought up to date. And I always find that when it comes to accuracy, it needs to be part of the fun. You can't make it a thing that disqualifies you from building something. You get a new kit and you look at it and like, the contour of the tail is wrong. I'm not going to build this now. You see a lot of these days, people who are sort of dubbed rivet counters by people who don't like to put the work in, will point out the fact that things have to be fixed, and they can be fixed. And they're not that hard to fix. Plastic is a very forgiving medium. So you need to build the accuracy into the fun part of your hobby. Discovering the things to fix is fun. Then fixing those things is a big accomplishment. It makes your model unique and makes it an even more useful contribution to the historical record. And finally, if you're a model builder, I probably don't have to tell you this, but a story makes building a model a much more powerful experience. And I say this having done a lot of work interviewing pilots from the past in my book work. When I sit down to build a model of one of those subjects that is in one of those books, I always pick somebody I met and knew, and it's got a lot more resonance to me. Looking through the display case, I found that there were 11 models in my collection that were built by people I know. I've got a picture of Dean Caswell of the Corsair Ace holding his model that I built when I took it to him at an ACES symposium that we did with the Northern California Friends of the Aces, and he was super happy to see it, and the picture is really meaningful. And the fact that he was really into seeing his own aircraft as a model tells you how powerful these things are. And with that, I'd like to just say, if you're building, keep building, and if you're not building, what's stopping you? So, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Oh, back in the back. The question was, have you ever gone to museums to look at the real aircraft to gain accuracy? And the answer is for sure yes. The caveat is, with restored aircraft, you have to be aware of what's modern and what's not. Because a lot of times a modern warbird is not really a great reference because of all the things put into it to make it safe to fly today and make it convenient to fly today. A lot of museum pieces, if you can, I've really gotten in the habit of talking to the curators and the people there about the history of the restoration of the aircraft. For us, model nerds, oftentimes the best model to look at, or the best aircraft to look at in a museum, is one that hasn't been restored at all. To everybody else who walks in that building, it looks like a piece of junk. To the modelers, it's like, this is a time capsule frozen right when the airplane stopped operating. So yeah, that's part of it. It's a fun thing. It's a fun thing for modelers. 2 weeks ago, there was a contest on the Hornet, and it was very amusing to see all these 50-plus-year-old guys shoehorning themselves into the cockpits of these jet fighters. Like I said, we're all big kids, so it never really goes away. Oh, see, this is you weren't in the club when this kit came out. You weren't around because there was a lot of hemming and hawing about this, and this is what modelers are great about. The D had that dog leg, the B didn't, and there's a guy in our club who was scratch building. He was converting a 32nd scale model of the D into a B, and had to rebuild the entire wing because it just didn't match the real aircraft. Yeah, there's a slight dog leg on the B there on the photograph. It's nowhere near as dramatic. It's there, but the angle is gentle. It's not like this. But the other thing about this kit, I can tell you from personal experience. I got a flight in a P-51 Mustang as a thank you from Mike Burton over there for chairing the Nationals in 1998. And having built a couple of these models, the first thing I noticed when I got in the cockpit and looked over the nose was that the nose was round. It wasn't square like the kit. And that ruined this kit for me forever. Having sat in the airplane and flown in it, for goodness sakes, it's got to be accurate. But I'm saying that it's not the most accurate kit out there. I'm making no aspersions towards your building abilities. I think it's probably a beautiful model. But again, it's that accuracy level. We keep aspiring to greater and greater and greater accuracy, right? Oh yeah. So the roof was overall gray. It was that Japanese gray, which is if you're a modeler, you know that one of the best ways is to replicate it is to use Floquil railroad color cement. It's a kind of a slightly greenish cast gray. So if you've seen like Tora, those airplanes were supposed to represent those aircraft, the gray Zeros. It was the standard Japanese naval scheme for a long time with the black cowling. So you can sort of understand how when that paint starts to break down and the layers underneath show through, suddenly you've got a pink airplane. That actually makes sense. Painting them pink, there were British aircraft painted pink in World War II for reconnaissance purposes, low-level reconnaissance. But the idea was to blend in with the light at dawn and at dusk. A pink airplane in the snow was probably a really bad idea up there in the Aleutians. There they are. They already have a big red dot, for goodness sakes. They don't need to paint the airplane pink. Dennis, thank you so much for the opportunity.